Normac Cameron has said, "Hello TIK, I am a proud new patron of your amazing content, and I have a question regarding infantry equipment on the Soviet Axis front." So here is some context before my main question. I have heard from multiple sources that during the later years, 1944 to 45, on the Soviet Axis front, that Soviet troops had a huge advantage when it came to infantry equipment, mainly small arms. Their PPSH-41s and PPS-43s would mow German troops armed mainly with Kar-98 bolt-action rifles and maybe the occasional MP-40 SMG. Is this really true? It seems like the German army would have realised that including more semi-automatic and SMGs into their divisions would have helped equalise close-up infantry combat. And while the Germans did produce the STG-44, these sources didn't mention them, or if they did, they said the weapon wasn't present enough on the front line to make any difference. Are these claims that the STG-44 was not present enough to counter the Soviet SMGs true as well? Keep up the good work, TIK. An interesting question, and here's a list of sources I've used to answer it, which I'll list in the description. You'll also find another link in the description as well, because last week I narrated a video about Operation Winter Storm, the Stalingrad relief attempt, for historian Anton Jolly on his channel. Unlike this video, it was full of primary source documents, so make sure you check it out if you missed it, because in the process of making that video, both of us realised some very interesting elements about that period that we both previously missed in our studies of Stalingrad, and we'll be discussing it in the future. Link in the description and at the end of the video. So, did Soviet troops have a huge advantage when it came to infantry equipment, and did they mow down the Germans with huge numbers of submachine guns? Well, it is true that Soviet infantry were armed with a lot of submachine guns in the late war years. Comparing Soviet rifles to submachine gun production, 34% of production during the war years went to submachine guns, whereas the Germans had just 11% of their production geared towards them. Now, it's worth noting here that Soviet submachine gun production started off very low, and then quickly ramped up as the war progressed, so it was more than 34% in the late war years, and lower in the early ones. And it is true that whole units of the Red Army were armed with nothing but submachine guns. At least in theory, the NKO equipped one rifle, submachine gun company, per rifle regiment with the PPSH, and in addition created a machine gun platoon in the 1st, 4th and 7th companies in each Red Army rifle battalion. The German riflemen were also at a firepower disadvantage. The rate of fire for a trained rifleman with a Kar-98K was 15 rounds per minute, including the reloading of the rifle with their 5-round clips. The rate of fire for a PPSH-41 submachine gun was 900 rounds per minute, although in practice they only carried 150 to 200 rounds, but even so, there was a clear advantage in terms of the number of bullets in the air. A 10-man squad armed with bolt-action rifles had a practical combined firepower of 150 rounds per minute at best, armed with the PPSH-41 submachine guns, and that firepower would increase to as much as 1,500 rounds per minute. Worse, when comparing the raw number of submachine guns being produced by both sides, it does appear that the Germans were in trouble. By the end of 1943, the Soviets had produced 3,619,700 submachine guns. That's actually more than twice as many MP-40s and MP-38s that the Germans produced throughout the entire war. In fact, by the end of 1943, the Germans had only produced 827,722 MP-40s and MP-38s. The Germans only managed to produce 1,047,600 MP-40s, compared to 6,173,900 PPSH-41s, 1,500,000 Thompson submachine guns from the USA, and a whopping 4 million Sten guns from Great Britain. So yes, they were trailing behind in terms of submachine gun production. All of the Soviets were equipped with semi-automatic rifles, or short-barreled submachine guns that were capable of firing 72 rounds from drum magazines. I took one of the submachine guns and several drum magazines from one of the prisoners for my own use, as I no longer placed much faith in the slow-firing 98K carbine for close combat. I felt more confident equipped with a high-capacity automatic weapon, and it was to remain with me for many months. But what's interesting is this: MP40 production actually peaked in 1941, and then remained about level for the rest of the war. Yes, when production of rifles was increasing as the war went on, as well as tanks and other equipment, the number of submachine guns that the Germans were producing had actually levelled off. That's a little bit strange. If submachine guns offered an advantage, like we're meant to believe, then surely the Germans would have ramped up production of the submachine gun that they actually had, and yet they didn't. Inaccurate beyond any distance greater than about 50 feet, 15 meters, the fire of the MP40 resembled that of a shotgun more than a rifle. Though it was the standard weapon for a forward observer, I would have preferred to retain my Mauser. This account is interesting because the effective range of the MP40 was meant to be 200 meters. However, it's clear that the value of a product, like a submachine gun, is subjective, meaning the user decides its worth. This user clearly wanted something that could hit a target at longer distances, which a Kar 98K definitely could. Although some might complain of the weight of the Mauser rifle, or the cleaning required to keep it functional and rust-free in grim conditions, few questioned its accuracy or reliability. Indeed, the rifle was generally more accurate than the men who used it. One of the reasons the semi-automatic rifles never fully replaced the Kar 98K as sniper rifles was that, despite the best efforts of their designers, the older rifle was still a more inherently accurate weapon. So, while at first glance it does appear that the German riflemen would be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Soviet submachine guns, it does seem that there's more to this story than the raw numbers alone. It's true that a submachine gun could fire off a lot of rounds very quickly, but what was their effective range? It was less than 200 meters. And if you're engaging someone on the sparse Russian steppe, or if you're on the defensive, you're going to be firing at distances longer than that. A Kar 98K could hit a target 3 or more times further than that. If it had a scope, a kilometre wasn't impossible. So, if you imagine a bunch of Soviets armed with submachine guns versus a bunch of Germans with rifles, the Germans with rifles can pick off the Soviets long before they get into effective firing range. But if the Soviets armed with submachine guns did get into range, then they had the clear advantage, such as at Stalingrad, where Chuikov told his men to keep close to the enemy at a range of less than 50 meters. Not only would this mitigate the enemy's artillery and firepower, since the Germans risked hitting their own troops at such close ranges, but it would allow the rapid fire of their submachine guns to be far more effective than the slow reloading rifles. This is, in fact, why the Soviet storm groups in that battle were so effective, because they built those close combat groups around the submachine gun. And when fighting in villages and towns on their way to Berlin, the Soviets also relied upon infantry with submachine guns, grenades and Molotov cocktails for much the same reason. The point is, a submachine gun was very effective at ranges less than 200 meters, preferably half that distance. Whilst a rifle was very good at long distance shooting, 300 to above 600 meters. So it really did depend on the terrain and the circumstances. For Blitzkrieg or Bewegungskrieg type warfare, where you're avoiding built-up areas, the rifles are probably the way to go. When you're fighting room by room in an urban area, then submachine guns would be the weapon of choice. However, it is a bit more complicated than this. No side went to war with just rifles and submachine guns. German squads in World War II were built around the light or medium machine gun, not the rifle or the submachine gun. A typical 10-man squad was armed with a 3-man machine gun team, MG34 or MG42, 6 riflemen, and the NCO with his submachine gun, MP38 or MP40. The machine gun provided most of the squad's firepower, while the riflemen acted as ammunition carriers and provided local security for the machine gun team. Notice in this setup that everyone is secondary to the rapid-firing machine gun. The machine gun is the central piece of the puzzle here. Later in the war, the number of men in a squad decreased to 9, with a rifleman being lost, and one of the remaining riflemen replaced his rifle for a submachine gun, increasing the firepower of the squad quite significantly. But even in this scenario, the machine gun was the main weapon that the rest of the squad gravitated around. And this makes sense. Statistics from Allied casualties show that 60% were from mortars and artillery, most of the rest were machine guns, and perhaps 10 to 20% were from rifles. And that's despite the fact that the majority of soldiers were armed with them. So the Germans knew that, for a typical squad, the machine gun was the most important element. Coupled with the fact that studies by both the Allies and the Axis in both world wars, and between the wars, concluded that most combat would take place at ranges less than 400 metres, because beyond that it was difficult to see the target, let alone hit them. And it might start to make sense why the Germans weren't at a significant disadvantage with their rifles. Rifles and machine guns would fire away at an enemy 400 or more meters away, well out of range of the submachine guns, and offered very effective suppression fire at that distance. Given the fact that the Germans had the clear advantage when it came to their machine guns, the MG42 fired a ridiculous 1,200 rounds per minute, the Soviets would be at a severe disadvantage unless they could get within 200 meters or less to start using their submachine guns. Considering the amount of bullets flying around from that MG42, it's not hard to imagine Soviet soldiers hugging the ground rather than risking charging through that level of firepower. Of course, if they did get within 200 meters, then the Germans were the ones in trouble. Combined with the Soviet tactics of getting and staying close to the enemy, German infantry were often incapable of matching the levels of small arms firepower produced by their opponents, and tactical sophistication was often drowned in a hail of 7.62mm rounds. As you mentioned in the original question, the Germans also produced the STG Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, which was a leap forwards in terms of technology, since it combined the submachine gun's rate of fire with an intermediate cartridge, allowing them to engage enemies in the medium 600-meter range or less. What you didn't mention is that the Germans also produced several semi-automatic rifles, like the Gev 41 and 43, the FG 42, and the Volksgewehr. Yes, these weren't great weapons, especially the Volksgewehr, but combined with the STG 44, the number of these weapons was somewhere in the region of all the MP40s ever produced. And these did increase the firepower of the German infantry, although again their numbers were still too low overall to change the strategic picture. The Germans also captured a lot of Soviet and Allied submachine guns and semi-automatic rifles, and made use of them. In fact, they captured so many PPSH-41s that they actually had specific designations for them when they used them, such as the MP717Rs. So the Germans did have more firepower than at first glance. Therefore, to answer your question fully, I don't think the German squads were pushovers in the late war. even if they were still relying on the Kar 98K rifle. Sure, in the city battles like Stalingrad in the mid-war, or Berlin in the late war, as well as in the towns and villages across Europe, yes, they were at a significant disadvantage to the Soviet submachine gun menace. But in the open countryside, and especially on the steppes of Russia, they probably had the advantage, thanks largely to their impressive machine guns, around which they built their squads. We also have to factor in artillery and mortars, direct-fire guns like the PAKs, and tanks and aircraft and so on. Obviously we're talking about the late war at this point, so some of these weren't around much, but they would certainly add to the long-distance suppressive firepower of the German infantry. And I think this is why we might have accounts from German authors saying they mowed down the Red Army hordes, because an MG42 gunner supported by riflemen might have done just that at a comfortable distance. But then, if just a handful of surviving Soviet submachine gunners got into the German trenches, they would slaughter the Germans in turn, which then explains why the Soviet accounts talk about killing loads of Germans. Both sides claim to have killed hordes of their enemy, and this submachine gun versus rifles and machine gun range distances might explain that. It also might explain why the Soviets were at a disadvantage in the early part of the war. In the 1941 and 1942 period, they had a lack of submachine guns, a lack of machine guns, a lack of mortars and artillery, so it's not hard to imagine the German machine guns and rifles, coupled with tanks and Stukas, having a massive firepower advantage during this period. And you don't have to hit someone to take them out. If you've got a rifle and a grenade, and you're half a mile away from the enemy, who's hitting you with machine gun fire and rifle fire and Stukas and tanks, are you seriously going to keep fighting? The easiest option would be to run away, or if that's not possible, surrender. And we see just that in the early war period. In the book Croatian Legion by Jason D. Mark, there's an instance where a Stug battery from the 197th Sturmgeschütz Battalion assisted the Croatians in one of their attacks in 1941. After firing at a distance upon the enemy with machine guns and Stugs, the Croatians charged and engaged their Soviet riflemen at close range. One Croatian threw a grenade into a Soviet trench and accepted the surrender of the soldiers in that portion of the trench. He then picked up the same grenade, yes, he hadn't pulled the trigger on it, and threw it into the next part of the trench, and did the same, and then again, and again. And he admitted to the Germans afterwards that he'd been using the same grenade over and over for weeks. And I think, since the Soviet conscripts were getting hit by tanks or assault guns and machine guns and so on at a distance, they're suppressed and have hardly any equipment to fight back with, so they were eager not to die in what was clearly a hopeless situation, and so they surrendered. It's only as the Soviet industry started pumping out mortars, artillery and submachine guns from the mid to late 1942 period onwards that we start to see the Red Army be able to go toe-to-toe with the Germans. And the lack of firepower might explain a lot of this. It would also explain why the Soviets decided to charge the German lines, because they needed to get close to have any chance versus the German long-range weaponry. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and supporting. Bye for now.